Today, in Has Anyone Else Heard of the Crossing Hour? We follow Luca Martínez, a skeptical young man who is drawn into a horrifying experience by his childhood friend, Marco. After receiving a chilling phone call from Marco warning him about a mysterious and dangerous phenomenon known as the crossing hour, Luca's disbelief turns into terror. At exactly 3:13 a.m., reality distorts, and Luca finds himself battling against a sinister force that emerges from the shadows, waiting to trap anyone who moves during this supernatural window of time. Luca Martínez had never been one to believe in urban legends. Ghost stories were just that, story. But everything changed one cold night in late October when he received a chilling phone call from his childhood friend Marco. "It's real, Luca. Crossing hour. It's not just a myth." Marco's voice trembled through the phone, barely a whisper. "It happened to me, and if I'm right, it's gonna happen again tonight." Luca chuckled at first, thinking it was a joke. Marco had always been the prankster in their group, especially around Halloween. This time, something was different. The fear in Marco's voice was unmistakable, and there was a strange urgency in his words. "What are you talking about, man? You sound insane," Luca replied, pacing his dimly lit apartment. Marco paused for a moment before responding, as if struggling to find the right words. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the world changes. It's like time bends, and everything around you, every shadow, every sound, becomes something else. And if you move, you'll disappear. Ever. Luca felt a chill crawl down his spine, but he pushed the feeling away. He had heard of strange phenomena before, sleep paralysis, lucid dreaming, but this was too much. "Marco, you need to get some sleep, okay? You're probably just..." "No." Marco's voice cracked. "Luca, I'm warning you. You don't know what you're dealing with. At 3:13, lock yourself in a room, don't move, don't make a sound, and whatever you do, don't check the time." The call abruptly ended, leaving Luca in silence. He stared at his phone, unsure of what to make of it. Was Marco just messing with him, or had something truly terrifying happened? That night, Luca couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. He sat on the edge of his bed, glancing at the clock. 2:58 a.m. Marco's words echoed in his head. 3:13 a.m. Lock yourself in a room. Don't move. Luca smirked. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself. But the seed of curiosity had been planted, and it grew with every passing minute. By 3:10 a.m., Luca found himself wide awake, staring at the clock. His heart pounded, anticipation mixing with anxiety. What's the harm in seeing for myself? Thought. After all, there was no such thing as the crossing hour. Right? Right? Luca felt his palms grow sweaty. He glanced around his room, the darkness thick and oppressive. Every shadow seemed to shift, elongating in unnatural ways. Suddenly, the room felt smaller, the air heavier, the silence louder. Luca's breath quickened as the clock ticked closer to the hour. 3:13 a.m. Luca froze. The room changed. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows creeping towards him. The ticking of the clock grew deafening, pounding in his ears. He could feel it. Something was in the room with him. But Marco had said not to move, not to make a sound. Luca held his breath, fighting the overwhelming urge to glance at the clock. The seconds dragged on, stretching into what felt like hours. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, to hide, to escape the suffocating terror that had descended upon him. Then a faint whisper broke the silence. "Luca." His blood ran cold. It wasn't Marco's voice. It wasn't a voice he recognized at all. And it was coming from directly behind him. Luca's heart nearly stopped. Clenched his fists, every nerve on edge. That voice, it was so close, almost as if someone were standing directly behind him. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with dread. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to confront whatever was there. But Marco's warning echoed in his mind. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." He stayed perfectly still. "Luca?" The whisper came again, softer this time, but somehow more menacing, more insistent. Sweat dripped down his temple, his throat dry as sandpaper. Couldn't even swallow. His body was paralyzed, trapped between the overwhelming urge to flee and the terror that movement would bring something worse. The minutes stretched on, each one agonizingly slow. Luca's muscles ached from the tension, his jaw tight as he ground his teeth together. The room was silent again, but the darkness felt alive, pulsating with something unseen. He could feel it. The energy, a presence that hadn't been there before. It was as if the world outside had vanished, leaving him in some twisted parallel space where nothing made sense. He didn't dare check the time. He knew it was past 3:13. But how much longer could he last? His lungs burned, every breath shallow and careful. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. No, can't look, can't move. But it was hard to ignore, the way the shadows shifted unnaturally in the corners of the room, curling like smoke. Luca's heart hammered so loudly in his chest that he wondered if the thing behind him could hear it. The shadows grew bolder, creeping closer, slithering along the floor like living things. Kept his eyes fixed ahead, staring blankly at the wall. He didn't move, it couldn't reach him. That's what Marco had said, right? As long as he stayed perfectly still. The whisper came again, this time sharper, almost angry. Luca. His breath caught in his throat. Whatever it was, it knew his name. The voice wasn't just some random hallucination or trick of his mind. This was real, and it wanted him. The sound of soft footsteps made his stomach turn. Something was walking across the room, coming closer. The floorboards creaked under its weight, slow and deliberate, each step calculated, as if it was savoring his fear. Luca squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the tears that burned behind his eyelids. Don't move. Don't move. The air beside him grew colder, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. He could feel it now. It was right next to him, standing so close he could almost sense its breath on his neck. The sound of the clock ticking filled the room, louder than ever, but beneath it was the steady, terrifying rhythm of his own pulse. Then, a chilling sensation washed over him. Something brushed against his arm, light as a feather but cold as ice. His skin prickled with goosebumps. Luca bit down hard on his lip, trying desperately not to scream. Another touch, this time on his shoulder. He was shaking now, his entire body quivering with fear. Whatever it was touching him. And he couldn't move, couldn't fight back, couldn't do anything but wait in paralyzed terror. Luca. The voice was right next to his ear now, low and guttural. Couldn't take it anymore. His body acted on pure instinct. Without thinking, Luca leaped up from the bed, spinning around to face the thing that had been tormenting him. There was nothing. His room was empty. The shadows were still, the eerie presence gone in an instant, as if it had never been there at all. Luca stood in the middle of the room, his chest heaving with panicked breaths, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. He glanced at the clock on his nightstand. 3:14 a.m. A minute had passed. Just 1 minute. But it felt like hours. Luca wiped the sweat from his brow, his legs trembling as he sat back down on the bed. He was alive. He hadn't disappeared. What was that? What had he just experienced? His skin still tingled where it had touched him, a lingering coldness that refused to fade. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, startling him. It was a message from Marco. Did you move? Luca hesitated, his hands shaking as he picked up the phone and replied, Yes. The response came almost immediately. You're not safe anymore. It's coming for you. Luca's blood turned to ice. He stared at the message, unable to believe what he was reading. His breathing quickened, and he instinctively glanced around the room. Everything looked normal now. The atmosphere was still thick with unease. His phone buzzed again. Get out. Now. Without thinking, Luca grabbed his jacket and darted for the door, his heart racing. The moment he stepped into the hallway, something felt wrong. The light above flickered, casting long, jagged shadows down the narrow corridor. The world outside his room was different. The familiar surroundings of his apartment building felt distant, warped. The walls seemed to stretch and shift as if they were alive. A creeping sense of dread washed over him as he realized the truth. Crossing hour wasn't over. It was just beginning. Luca sprinted down the hallway, the echo of his footsteps bouncing off the walls. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together the impossibility of what had just happened. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. But the fear gnawing at his gut told him one thing: he was no longer in control. Whatever had entered his world at 3:13 a.m. was still here. The hallway stretched on unnaturally, longer than it ever had before. Luca could feel the distortion in the air, like the walls were slowly closing in on him. His eyes darted from side to side, searching for the stairwell that was always just a few doors down, but now it was nowhere in sight. He reached a door, his neighbor's. Without hesitation, he pounded on it with both fists. Hello, please open up. "It's Luca." His voice cracked with panic, but there was no answer. No shuffling footsteps on the other side, just an oppressive silence. He knocked again, harder this time, but the door didn't budge. Suddenly, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark void inside the apartment. Luca froze. Something was wrong. It wasn't just dark, it was emptiness. A space that seemed to swallow all light, all sound. He backed away from the door slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. This isn't real. Can't be real. The hallway behind him felt colder, and that whispering voice returned, faint but unmistakable. "Luca." He turned, eyes wide, and there it was again. Those shifting shadows creeping along the walls. Their movements slow but deliberate, like they were stalking him. His breath came in shallow bursts as he watched them gather in the corners, twisting and swirling like dark tendrils. Without thinking, he bolted for the end of the hall. But the distance seemed to stretch even farther, as though the hallway was alive, teasing him, keeping the exit just out of reach. The light above flickered again, casting fleeting glimpses of the shifting darkness that followed close behind. He needed to get out, now. Panic overtook him as he flung himself at the stairwell door. It was locked. Luca rattled the handle, slamming his shoulder into it in a desperate attempt to break through, but it didn't budge. Behind him, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. His phone buzzed again. He yanked it from his pocket, hands trembling, and glanced at the screen. "Marco, don't let it catch you." Luca's breath hitched. He could feel it now. Present. Drawing closer. That cold, otherworldly force creeping up behind him, ready to drag him into whatever twisted dimension it came from. His mind raced, searching for any way out. The elevator. He spun on his heel and ran toward the elevator at the other end of the hall. The shadows seemed to close in, their tendrils slithering faster, drawn to his fear. When Luca reached the elevator, he jabbed the button repeatedly, praying for the doors to open. "Come on, come on." A soft ding echoed down the hallway as the doors slid open. Relief surged through him until he saw what was inside. The elevator wasn't empty. A figure stood in the center of the car, motionless, facing the back wall. It was tall, hunched, its limbs unnaturally long. A dark, tattered coat hung from its thin frame, and its head tilted slightly, as though it was listening for something. Luca froze, too terrified to breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge him. But he knew that it was waiting for him. His mind screamed at him to run, flee from whatever that thing was, but his legs wouldn't move. His eyes locked on the figure, trapped by the eerie stillness of it. The elevator doors remained open, beckoning him inside. The air around him thickened with dread. Suddenly, the figure's head twitched. It turned ever so slightly, just enough for Luca to glimpse part of its face. Pale, hollow eyes, lips stretched impossibly wide into a grotesque smile. The air left Luca's lungs as his body finally reacted. He stumbled back, nearly falling over himself, and sprinted in the opposite direction. The whispering was louder now, echoing from all around him. "Luca, come closer." He ran faster, his vision blurring with panic. The hallway seemed to warp, twisting unnaturally, the doors and walls bending as though they were melting. He could feel it, presence closing in on him from all sides. The stairwell. This time, the door was slightly ajar. Luca slammed through it, taking the stairs two at a time. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he didn't dare stop. The further he descended, the more distorted everything became. The stairwell's familiar structure was giving way to something more nightmarish, as if reality itself was unraveling around him. The walls rippled like water, the steps stretching and narrowing in uneven ways. Luca grabbed the railing to steady himself, but it too twisted under his grip, turning slick and cold like the skin of some unseen creature. A low rumble vibrated through the stairwell, and the shadows below seemed to pulse, growing darker and denser. Luca's mind was fraying, the rational part of him struggling to make sense of what was happening. But nothing made sense anymore. This was no longer his world. Then, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing from above, slow, steady, and getting closer. Luca glanced over his shoulder, his heart seizing in his chest. The figure from the elevator was there, standing at the top of the stairwell, its grotesque smile still plastered across its face. Didn't move, didn't rush down the stairs. It didn't need to. Because the shadows beneath Luca began to rise. They oozed up from the steps like thick, black tar, reaching for him, tendrils of darkness clawing at his legs. Luca screamed and fought against them, pulling himself away with every ounce of strength he had left. The shadows latched onto his ankles, pulling him back, dragging him down. "Please," cried, his voice breaking. "Please let me go." And then everything stopped. The shadows recoiled, and the figure at the top of the stairs vanished. Luca's heart raced, his breath ragged, as he slowly stood up. The stairwell was silent again. Empty. But the eerie feeling in the pit of his stomach told him it wasn't over. Luca climbed to his feet, his legs weak and trembling. He stumbled down the last few steps and pushed through the door at the bottom of the stairwell. What greeted him on the other side wasn't the lobby of his apartment building. It was a long, narrow hallway, one he didn't recognize. A single light flickered at the far end, casting distorted shadows along the walls. The air was cold, stale. Luca swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he stepped into the hallway. Then he heard it. Clock chiming. The sound rang out, slow and deliberate. It was 3:13 a.m. again. Luca stood frozen in the unfamiliar hallway, his body trembling with exhaustion and terror. The eerie chime of the clock echoed around him, each strike a reminder of the impossible. It was 3:13 a.m. again. Time hadn't just moved forward, it had looped back, trapping him in this nightmare. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of him, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. Luca's eyes darted around, desperate for something familiar, something to tell him that he hadn't completely slipped into madness. But there was nothing, just walls that seemed to twist and ripple, shadows that moved of their own accord, and that faint, rhythmic ticking of the unseen clock. A cold sweat broke out across his skin as he took a tentative step forward. The floor beneath him groaned, as if protesting his movement. Every instinct screamed for him to turn back. But where would he go? The stairs? The shadowed figure? Whatever had chased him here was still out there, lurking, waiting. Couldn't turn back. He had to move forward. With every step, the hallway seemed to stretch further. The light ahead flickered violently, casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the walls like grasping fingers. Luca tried not to look too closely at them. Every time his eyes focused on the darkness, he swore he could see faces forming, twisted and grotesque, their mouths open in silent screams. The ticking grew louder. Luca's breathing became shallow, each breath catching in his throat. He reached for his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed Marco's number again. Line rang once, twice, and then clicked. "Marco," Luca gasped, his voice a frantic whisper. "I'm stuck. It's 3:13 again. I can't." "Did you move?" Marco's voice was barely audible, muffled by static. Luca's throat tightened. He remembered the moment he had broken Marco's one rule, when he had leapt off the bed, driven by fear, by the terrible whisper in the room with him. "I had to. It was right there." "You broke the rule." Marco's voice was different now, cold, distant. "Luca, I warned you. If you move during the crossing hour, it finds you, and it doesn't let go." A wave of dread crashed over him. "What do you mean? What finds me?" Marco was silent for a moment, the static growing louder. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Time isn't real anymore, Luca. You're not in your world. You're in its." A sharp chill ran down Luca's spine. "Marco, what the hell are you talking about? What is this?" "It's the crossing hour," Marco said, his voice trembling. "Every night at 3:13 a.m., time bends, it comes, it hunts. If you stay still, if you don't acknowledge it, you can survive. But if you move..." Luca's grip tightened on the phone. "What happens if you move?" There was a long pause before Marco answered, his voice filled with a quiet terror. "You become part of it." The phone line went dead. Luca stared at his screen, panic rising in his chest. He dialed Marco's number again, but the call wouldn't go through. His heart pounded in his ears, each beat echoing the ticking of the clock. He felt trapped, like a fly in a web, with something terrible looming just out of sight. Then he heard it, a soft scraping sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from behind him. Luca turned slowly, his stomach twisting into knots. At the far end of the hallway, something moved in the shadows. It was faint at first, barely a flicker, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw it. The figure from the elevator, its long, distorted limbs, its hunched posture, and that horrifying smile. It stood motionless at the end of the hallway, its head tilted slightly as if watching him, Luca's heart seized in his chest. He took a step back, his legs shaking, but the figure didn't move. Just stood there, waiting. He could feel its eyes on him, cold and predatory, studying him. For a moment, Luca considered running. But where? The hallway was endless, and the shadows seemed to shift and stretch with every step he took. There was no escape. "Don't move," he thought, the words repeating in his head like a mantra. Marco had warned him. Moving had broken the rules, and now this thing was hunting him. If he moved again, would it get closer? Was it waiting for him to make another mistake? He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust, and forced himself to stay still. The figure didn't move. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, the grotesque smile almost glowing in the dim light. Luca's mind raced. He needed a plan, some way out. His eyes darted around the hallway, looking for anything that could help him escape. But the hallway was barren, an empty void that twisted and warped around him. Only thing that remained constant was the ticking, that relentless ticking. Suddenly, the shadows near the walls began to shift again. They coiled and twisted, snaking toward him with a predatory grace. Luca's breath hitched as the tendrils of darkness reached out, brushing against his legs like icy fingers. He flinched instinctively, his body tensing. The figure took a step forward. "No," Luca whispered under his breath, pulse skyrocketing. It was getting closer. Another step, then another. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its eyes locked on Luca with an unnatural intensity. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet were glued to the floor. If he moved, it would catch him. But if he stayed still, it would still reach him, eventually. There was no way out. And then, in the distance, Luca saw something that made his heart stop. At the end of the hallway, barely visible in the flickering light, was a door. It was old, wooden, and slightly ajar. A faint light spilled through the crack, like a beacon in the darkness. It was the first sign of hope he had seen since this nightmare began. Without thinking, Luca made his decision. He bolted. Figure screeched, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that tore through the air like nails on a chalkboard. Luca's legs burned as he sprinted toward the door, his vision blurring with panic. The shadows rose around him, swirling like a storm. Their cold tendrils grasping at his ankles, his arms trying to drag him down. But he didn't stop. The figure's footsteps thundered behind him, gaining speed. It was coming for him, and it was close, too close. Luca could feel its breath on his neck, could hear its jagged wheezing as it reached out to grab him. He reached the door and threw it open, diving through the threshold just as the figure lunged for him. Luca hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of his lungs. He scrambled to his feet, slamming the door shut behind him. His chest heaved with ragged breaths as he backed away from the door, his entire body trembling. He was safe. For now. The room around him was small and cramped, lit only by a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with old faded wallpaper, and a rickety wooden chair sat in the corner. But what caught Luca's attention was the object on the floor in the center of the room. Clock. It was an old, ornate grandfather clock, its pendulum swinging slowly back and forth. The ticking was loud, deafening in the silence. And on its face, the time was frozen at 3:13 a.m. Luca stared at it, his stomach churning with unease. The door rattled behind him, the figure pounding on it from the other side. But Luca barely heard it. His eyes were glued to the clock, dread creeping up his spine as he realized the truth. He hadn't escaped. He was still trapped. In the crossing hour. Luca stood motionless, eyes locked on the grandfather clock in front of him. It was still stuck at 3:13 a.m., as if time had suspended itself in this twisted nightmare. The relentless pounding on the door behind him was only a reminder of the horrifying truth he already knew. He was still trapped. He hadn't escaped. He had only moved to a different part of the same nightmare. The pendulum of the clock swung slowly, its rhythmic tick-tock echoing through the small room, each sound a hammer blow to Luca's fraying nerves. He knew he couldn't run forever. Something was waiting for him, something he couldn't avoid any longer. The air in the room was thick with dread, suffocating him with the weight of inevitability. Whatever force had bent time at 3:13 was closing in, and Luca was on the verge of losing his mind. Suddenly, the pounding on the door stopped. An eerie silence filled the room, as if even the air itself had frozen, waiting for something to happen. Luca backed away, his gaze still locked on the clock. And then, that same cold, whispering voice filled the space, creeping through the air like a serpent. "Luca, you can't run forever." His heart nearly stopped. The voice was everywhere and nowhere at once. Luca turned, eyes darting around the small, dimly lit room, but there was no one there. Panic clawed at his chest, and his first instinct was to run again. But he knew deep down that there would be no more doors, no more places to hide. Whatever it was, it had been playing with him from the beginning. "Marco, you were right." But now it's too late, Luca thought, his throat tightening with the realization. The soft sound of something moving broke his thoughts, drawing his attention back to the clock. To his horror, the old wooden structure began to distort, as though being consumed by shadows. The edges stretched and darkened, warping into the shape of a figure, tall, hunched, with limbs too long and grotesque to be human. It was the same figure from the elevator. The creature had no eyes, but Luca felt its gaze on him, piercing and cold, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Its wide, unnatural smile stretched across its hollow face, and it took a step forward, each movement accompanied by the deafening sound of the ticking clock. "You broke the rules, Luca," whispered, the voice crawling over his skin like ice. "Now you are part of the hour. Part of us." Luca backed up against the wall, panic rising like a tidal wave. He glanced again at the clock, pendulum swinging in that endless loop of 3:13 a.m. He realized the truth that had been gnawing at him from the start. The crossing hour wasn't just a phenomenon. It was a prison, a cycle he would never escape. "You should never have moved." Beecher hissed, its voice a twisted mockery of humanity. "Now, time belongs to you." Luca tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. The shadowy form extended its reach, wrapping around him like a cold, suffocating mist. The room seemed to shrink as the walls closed in, and Luca felt the icy touch of the darkness spreading through him, freezing his limbs, locking him in place. He wanted to scream, fight, but it was too late. As the shadow consumed him, he understood what Marco had tried to warn him about. You become part of it. He was no longer Luca. He was part of the hour, part of the dark force that hunted anyone who broke the rules. Clock, frozen at 3:13 a.m., ticked one final, silent time. Days later, Marco woke up in his bed, heart pounding. Ever since that last call with Luca, he had felt something was terribly wrong. He'd tried calling Luca, but the phone always went to voicemail. Worry gnawed at him until he couldn't take it anymore. He had to go to Luca's apartment. When he arrived, the building looked normal, but an unsettling feeling washed over him. He knocked on Luca's door, but no one answered. After a few minutes, the landlord unlocked it, letting Marco inside. The apartment was eerily quiet. Everything seemed in place, except for one thing: the digital clock by Luca's bed. It was frozen. The time read 3:13 a.m. Marco stared at the clock, cold chill creeping up his spine. He knew what it meant. Luca wasn't here anymore, not in the way Marco understood. The crossing hour had claimed him. Without a word, Marco left the apartment, latte, the weight of his friend's fate hanging over him. That night, when Marco's own clock showed 3:13 a.m., didn't help but check the time. His breath caught in his throat, his room now drenched in a silence too thick, too menacing. The pendulum of this nightmare had now swung in his direction.